And girls, how you doing today? That's Anger Roleplay here once again, and today I want to show you guys the build that I've been playing for the last week in the Last Epoch. And this is a pretty close resemblance to the classic Hammerdin Paladin in Diablo 2 from about 20 years ago. But I decided I'm gonna different route. I'm not gonna run the spiraling, hovering, orbiting hammers, and I'm gonna use a Nova rune instead of the orbit. That's why my build is quite different. Overall, I can say that Hammer Throw is a fantastic skill. It's definitely been inspired by the Diablo 2 and Diablo 3, and it's pretty close to what it was back in the day. Except there are much more options. Now you can spec into 4 different directions. You can spec into the orbiting version, just like the old Diablo 2 and Diablo 3. Paladin, Hammerdin. You can also go with the ricochet, chaining rune. You can also get with the Nova version, and I decided I'm gonna stick with the Nova version simply because it fit my playstyle better, and I will tell you guys why I decided to go with the Nova and not the orbits. Overall, I really like the skill itself. It's very cheap and does an interesting amount of damage. At the same time, it does scale interestingly because it's not really melee skill, it's a throwing skill, so it scales pretty differently comparing to the other more straightforward melee skills out there. Another cool thing about the build itself, which I personally like, is that how it allows you to stretch out between the Sentinel, Forge Guard, Void Knight and the Paladin. You can practically take a little bit of this, a little bit of that, but the most throwing damage you can definitely find on the Forge Guard. It's a pretty balanced character, and it has a decent amount of offense and defense, tankiness, damage, everything is there, but there's also some certain areas of Void Knight and Paladin, and of course the Sentinel, which is your base class, where you can need to specialize into fully beef up everything on the build itself. As for how far I've progressed with the build, guys, I can tell that I level up to the 86, far behind what I supposed to be. Honestly, I decided I'm gonna be like 80, and then I decided I'm gonna go to the 85, but eventually I went up to the 86 and pretty much maxed out whatever I could. Was one-shotted at wave 145, I believe, so I will add an additional footage on that, so we actually have the actual footage of the gameplay, how the build plays up, so we have to see everything out there in action. Monoliths are not easy at all. I can go on like forever. The damage is pretty decent as well. You can see like there's over 10,000 crits there. So overall, I think it's a pretty solid build, very easy to play, hardcore friendly, because it's pretty good amount of defense over there. The con of the build is probably that it's not very easy to gear for, because it requires a very interesting amount of scaling yourself. So you're staking mostly crit, defense, as well as throwing damage, which is not very straightforward, as well as you need strength and dexterity too to maximize your damage on your main hammer throw skill. At the same time, it's pretty spammy. It's very active build, because you need to actively press around like 3-4 buttons, unlike most builds when you press like 2. And this build you actually need to play 4-5. Literally everything on your skill tree is very important. That's why if you want to build to have a lot of action, that is probably the build for you. So without further ado, guys, let's take a look deeper into the skills and everything, including the gear as well. Alright guys, let's take a look at the passive skill tree first, and we are starting with the Sentinel, of course. First thing you should be looking for is the Juggernaut. Definitely we gain strength, and strength scale our hammer throw. It scales with physical, throwing attack, strength and dexterity, so this is the first priority over here. The second is definitely Relentless, grants 40% increased damage and 120 stun avoidance. This is also very good to have. You don't want to get stunned, guys, because getting stung is very annoying. You can get chain stun and die. Pretty much it. The third is definitely a Retaliation, a 20% increased damage, and this bonus is double if you have blocked a hit in the last 4 seconds, and The block chance is not very high here. I haven't really invested a lot in the block chance, but once in a while you will still block, and 40% increased damage for free as a pretty damn good thing over here. Alright, next mastery class that we'll be using is the Forge Guard, because it synergizes really well with the throwing damage here. And the first thing you should be taking is Prime Fighter, Strength, and Attunement. Attunement, we don't really care about this, but Strength directly synergizes with the Hammer Throw skill. The second point is definitely the Pal Test. Increased throwing attack damage, throwing attack speed, very good for everything, mandatory. The third thing is definitely the Weapon Mastery. Once again, Dexterity, increased stun chance. Stun is actually pretty damn useful because stunning an enemy makes them kind of stopping for half a second, so you can attack them once again. So perma-stunning the enemy is very good, strong thing to have. This is mandatory once again. Another thing that I took here is Martial Cadence. 5% increased throwing attack damage for each melee attack you have used in the past 4 seconds. This is actually a very strong node, which most people do not realize, because we'll be using at least 2 melee attacks, which is Launch and Rebook. And so most of the time we'll be getting at least 10% of increased throwing attack damage, because we will be using these two all the fucking time. So this is good. You can also probably invest in this more. I had thoughts about this, but there are just better nodes of that to invest as well. And keep in mind that the way we'll be scaling this build is mostly a generic crit chance. So we will be investing heavily into crit where possible. So this node, which is Hammerhead, is incredibly mandatory. 100% increased crit strike chance with throwing skill, with throwing attacks. This is very important to have. Another big investment is the Javelinier. 100% increase to a crit strike multiplier with throwing attack skills. That's about it. I haven't invested any more on this, and we are moving forward to the Paladin. Paladin is here for only one reason: to gain the Holy Aura. This is a pretty important boost for literally any character right now in the game, and this is just too good not to invest into this, guys. It gives you pretty much everything, including high crit, high defense, and just incredibly useful for literally anything out there. Also that I decided to invest here is Conviction. 24% increased phase and fire damage and some physical penetration. For fire damage we do not care, we don't deal fire damage, but physical is definitely good to have. I also splitted the other half with the Defiance. 40% health and increased armor. Increased armor synergizes really well with the Ursul's Pride, which is described later, because increased mana regeneration per 100 points of armor. So the more armor you have, the more spam you can get out of your skill bar. That's about it. The last but not the least investment is going to the Void Knight section, and this is practically just the endgame VG, min-maxing the damage here. There's very important nodes over here which I decided to fully invest as well. The first is Abyssal Endurance, as this is playing for health and Void Protection, just incredibly good for the endgame, because Void is literally the only thing that can kill you in an instant. Another thing that I took is Sorrow Steel, just a little more void damage and increased physical damage, since we will be further investing later in the void damage as well. One node in the Void Corruption, +1 to crit strike multiplier per point in Void Knight, and since we are gaining levels in the Void Knight, that's about 20 more crit multi. And the last and the most important node is this Void Bolt. Throwing attacks deal more pretty much additional flat void damage on hit. This directly scales your damage, and for now it's unknown how much your default damage is, like default flat damage on the hammer throw, but adding this I can visually see just how my damage grows, how my crit grows, and I think this is practically one of the most important nodes to get, and this is what you will be getting after about level like 78 to about 85. That's about it. Now let's talk about the active skills, guys, and I will give you an explanation why I decided to go with the Nova. Well, in the first place, I tried playing with the orbit like everyone else and the spiral. And I just, after a certain amount of time, I stopped enjoying it because the wind up time was too high for me, and literally had to stop against the enemies and start winding up. Then you're moving, then you start winding up again. And after a certain amount of time, I realized that I feel like I'm doing damage, but this wind up time and the throwing attack speed is just becoming pretty annoying. So I'm looking into different options now. And I stopped looking when I discovered that Nova actually does, and the avatar of the Spire actually does everything I need, and still does quite a lot of damage. So I stopped on this, and I never looked back. That's practically it. What's the difference between the spiral orbit and the avatar of the Spire? So basically, the avatar of the Spire doubles the number of projectiles unless you hammer a spiral. And since we are removing the spiraling with the Enros technique, we still get everything from this, including the double number of projectiles. So how the build works in general is you take wing hammers first, then try to get the double damage with the ballista, of course invest in the catapult, then invest in the avatar of the Spire, then invest into iron spiral and hammer vortex, and going down to rapid throw, and the last node definitely will be Enros technique. What Enros technique does is, if your hammers would spiral, they still deal 80% increased damage. So we are literally removing the spiraling hammers. They are still there, but they just do not spiral anymore. But we get 80% increased damage. Now, if your hammers would orbit, they would instead have a 4% additional critical base strike chance. So we are removing the orbit. We still have additional mana cost from this and this. So a hammer will cost us 12 now, which is a lot. But at the same time, we get 4 additional base critical strike chance. The reason why I decided to go after this is because the most critical strike chance you can get is only for the melee skills. A lot of weapons here in the game in the Last Epoch have dramatic amount of flat damage, flat added base critical strike chance, but it only applies to the melee attacks. And unfortunately, just very hard to scale global crit chance. And this is one of the only ways how we can get the global base critical strike chance. So effectively, this easily out damages both the spiral and the orbit, and it's even worth the mana cost, in my opinion. So that's about it. That's the reasoning why. The last node that I invested was wing hammers, because basically projectile speed also affects your throwing attack speed, also affects how fast you start throwing, and projectile speed just affects how fast they fly and reach to the enemies. So both of these modifiers affect your hammer throws. That's about it. Now about the pros and the cons of spiraling, orbiting, and not orbiting and using the Nova. First of all, when you spiral, you have, like I said, a wind up time, so you actually need to start spinning, and then it does damage. So spiraling in general have one problem. When you start moving away from the enemies, like the enemies that are nearby, you need to stop and start spinning again to actually damage them. The enemies that are somewhere around you, they actually start getting damage. So the more you move, the less damage you do. When you spiral, you get a lot of damage to the single target, because this is actually like face-to-face action. And when you're face-to-face, your hammers can hit a lot of the single target. And this is basically when you do the most damage. They can machine gun. With the orbiting, it's quite different, since you bring all hammers with you. And the problem with the orbiting is that you are doing less damage to the targets that are far away, because all hammers move with you. They are not spiraling away, they are spiraling around you. And so when you move, you're like moving with all hammers around you, and if the enemy is chasing you, he just don't get hit, and he's still chasing you, he's still running. And the enemies somewhere in the corners and behind, they just do not get hit. That's another problem of the orbit. I think I tried everything. I tried orbiting, I tried spiraling, and I honestly think that it's not entirely mandatory. Like whatever people think, it's not entirely mandatory, and I proved here with this build, guys, that it's true. There's one important thing that I wanted to say about different options once again: spiral, orbit, and avatar of the Spire. So when you get spiral and when you get orbit, you add a lot of mana cost, like I said. If you add just a spiral, it's not a problem because you'll be using 2 rings, which reduce the throwing attack mana cost by 4, effectively giving you a free cast cost of the spiral. But when you add orbit on top, this is where becoming problematical. This is where you start draining your mana more, and it is becoming hard to sustain and cast all your skills like effortlessly for free. This is where you need an extra mana generation. And if you are using just the spiral, like in most other builds, you will have no problems. But if you're using the orbit, the spiral, and the Enros technique, this is where problems becoming. And this is where you will need this unique body armor called Urzel's Pride. It's pretty common for the mana hungry skills out there, and it gives you 2% of increased mana generation per 100 points of armor. It also synergizes really well with the build because it gives you armor and mana and strength as well, and strength gives additional damage to the hammer throw. With a decent amount of armor, you'll also get a decent amount of mana regeneration as well. So with both of this, the spiral and the orbit, I strongly recommend you to use Urzel's Pride because I tried running without this and it's just a pain. If you're using just a spiral, for example, then you can run any rare armor, like for example dexterity, health, strength, and glancing blow. Anything high armor, dexterity, strength, health, glancing blow. This is what you'll be running for. That's about it, guys. Take it into consideration. This is pretty important. Let's move on to another skill, and this is launch. This is our mobility and defense. First thing that you should be getting is definitely Tactician, then going to Fordrawn, and then the Unstoppable. Then I decided I'm gonna take Lunging Might, adds strength for 4 seconds after you complete the lunge. This is very good because, like I said, strength stacks our hammer thrown damage. And then I decided I'm gonna go with Overwhelm just to increase the stun chance when you lunge, as well as Ambush for additional stun chance. Another skill that we will be using is Rebook, and this is incredibly strong defensive technique. It's a channeling skill that does a bit of a powered up attack, but we'll be using this not for the damage but for the sake of defense, and this is pretty much the mandatory skill for any melee character out there. First of all, a regenerative shell, then we're stacking Brave of the Elements, augmented plating, or protective legacy, burst of speed, and then going into sudden vow, maximizing this. So when you press this, effectively we are getting a lot of defense. All our protections rise up quite high, and this lasts for about 4 seconds. That's pretty good, intense amount of defense, guys, and this is mandatory to stay alive in the higher arena. Another important thing, and the reason why we are speccing into Paladin a bit, is the Holy Aura. This is yet another defense and a very powerful offense as well. First of all, fleet-footed, 5 dexterity, guys. Once again, dexterity scales our hammer throw. Then we go into fanaticism, 25% increase attacking cast speed, and this is a global attack speed, so it affects the throwing attack damage as well as the melee attack damage. Pretty much attack speed, sorry. So it pretty much affects anything you do. Once again, True Strike, 8% reduced movement speed, but plus 4 crit strike chance. This is very good to have. And a 16% increased crit strike multiplier. The last one is definitely the dodge chances swiftness. Now, how the Holy Aura works, it's pretty much works by default like a passive when you have this. You see that all around me, but when you activate this, it also doubles the effect for a short amount of time. I only personally use it to kill the most toughest monsters, really big fat guys, or a very dangerous void packs. Outside of this, I'm using this passively, so it only depends on how much mana you can sustain and how fast and you can spam this practically. So if you can spam it, if you have enough mana to sustain this, you can spam it as much as you can, but I personally use it as a passive for now, because like I said, I compensated my crit chance with the Enrus technique and the spiraling knob that gives me 4% more base crit strike chance, so I compensated a bit of a lack of crit strike chance and inability to spam this holy aura with these two passives over there. That's about it. The last but not the least is the Devouring Orb, and this is a thing when we get to the Void Knight section in the passive skill tree. This is like practically 70 plus. When you start speccing more into Void Knight, you will be getting access to the Devouring Orb, and this is a very powerful defensive tool as well. 60% increase damage while you have a Devouring Orb, and you have two of them, almost free sometimes, and also Abyssal Juggernaut. While you have a Devouring Orb, you have 60 additional elemental protection and void protection, and 60% increase elemental protection and void protection as well. This all stacks up with everything you have, and this is both an offense and defense. This is just very good to have. Another thing is this: Devouring Orbs Void Rifts no longer increase in size of damage, but last 50% longer. This is incredibly important to have early on. The last thing is definitely Rift Caller. This is pretty much nothing, but Time Rod reduces attack and cast speed by 15%, increases time exchange duration by 25. So this is like a small debuff that you potentially get if enemies will hit by this, but most likely not. Still good to have here. Now let's talk about early leveling and the gear as well. There are plenty of cheap uniques that you can get, and all depends on whatever you have already and whatever you can drop on your first playthrough, but there are several ones that are pretty common and easy to get. The Falcon, of course, cheap unique armor. Next we go to the Keeper's Gloves, and well as the Slab. The Slab is also pretty cool. I used it early on as well. There's also very cool things like the Isidora's Revenge, which gives you 40% health and Glassing Blow chance, but the most important and probably the most powerful thing is definitely the Riverbend Grasp. This is literally as good as a very good end game pair of gloves. A 60% increase throwing damage, 40 health, and enormous amount of dodge rating. This is a very, very powerful gloves for the build, and this is what I recommend you to use extremely early as possible. Another cheap unique is definitely Viper Trail, and this slow on hit is very powerful because slow is probably one of the most useful stats debuffs because it's like a temporal change for the monsters. They just become incredibly slow and hit you less often. That's about it. For the end game, like I said, Ursul's Pride is probably the most useful unique out there because it doesn't really solve your mana problems, but it makes your life much easier if you decided you're gonna spec into full damage build like mine with the Orbit, Spiral, and Enrus techniques. So Ursul's Pride is probably the thing that you will be looking forward. As for the other end game uniques, there's also Bleeding Heart, which is quite rare, increased throwing attack speed, and 10% of damage leached as health. This is pretty damn powerful, but you know, a rare amulet with 5% of damage leached as health on hit is also not bad at all. However, there's also leeches like all damage and not just the damage on a hit. For the rest of the gear, like I said, this is mostly strength, dexterity, health, void protection, as well as glancing blow, whatever is possible. The weapon should look like this: crit strike chance or crit multiplier, and physical damage. So the way that this works is you can get either this or that. So it's either a crit multiplier plus strike chance or a physical damage plus strike chance. Strike chance is absolutely mandatory. The base for this will be also the blunt weapon, which is the club or a mace, because it gives you an increased stun chance. It's also, like I said, very powerful. Stunning enemies is good. Bleed is not as good, unfortunately, but this is the best thing I found so far. Slow on hit has been crafted there. Slow is probably the best craft you can get in a weapon, because I tried going blind, but I honestly do not see how blind is very effective so far. But slow, I can clearly see this walking and debuffing the enemies. Like I said, the amulet is mostly the Jade amulet with increased melee throwing attack speed. Leech is very important to stay alive early on, so this is your first priority while playing through this. Throwing attack damage is good to have, as well as dodge rating and health. Speaking about defense, I decided I'm gonna stacking a bit of everything, like dodge, a block chance, and glancing blow as invest priority, as well as a lot of armor, as much armor as possible for the Urzel sprite to work. The shield is this, practically as high base as possible, with as much high block chance as possible. Increase throwing attack damage, glancing blow, increase health and health. Void protection, if you have that, will be really good. The belt is practically a double glancing blow belt with increased health and whatever useful you can get there. The rings are another key items of the build. You can get 2 Jade rings with -4 throwing attack mana cost, otherwise you will not be able to do anything out there at all. These are pretty common rings, but it's not easy to get something useful like extra dexterity or extra health or extra strength. So getting very high tier 4, tier 5 throwing attack damage is your most priority out there. The boots are practically anything with move speed, health, strength, dexterity, and glancing blow on them. I also have another pair of boots with strength and a lot of movement speed, but not the high chance to receive a glancing blow, so I decided to switch that up. Gloves are this. Like I said, once again, incredible amount of throwing attack damage and also increased health and something useful like vitality, dexterity, as well as strength there too. The relic is probably the hardest thing to ever find for you, because you need a good base with crit multiply, and throwing attack damage is very hard to get there. So this is probably the hardest thing to get for the build, because it's mostly shit in most cases. So throwing attack damage, crit strike chance, and anything useful like health and void protection. That's about it. But if you don't have these gloves, guys, like I said, a Reverence Grasp is your best bet, because it's just an incredibly strong, powerful gloves for the early and from the end game as well. Alright guys, thanks for watching the video. I really hope you enjoyed the build guide. I wanted to do it as deep as possible, explanatory as possible. So keep an eye on my content. I'll be doing more Last Epoch, guys, but this is for now, because I'm be waiting for the 3.7 Path of Excellence League out there and be playing it as well. I know there are plenty of Hammerdin builds out there, but I'm pretty sure my one stands out from the rest, so I'm really happy how it turned out. I progressed very far. A lot of fun, because you know I've played 2 summoner builds in a row, and it's pretty refreshing to actually play the build that does some nasty amount of damage, like going into high crit. So I enjoyed this a lot, and I hope you enjoy this too, guys. Thanks for watching, and see you soon. First of all, I would like to thank you very much for watching the video. Your likes and dislikes, especially, as they push me forward even more. If you want to see more content, please consider subscribing to the channel. I do daily uploads of role-playing content, being it builds, guides, let's play, stream highlights, and upcoming RPG games. Also, don't forget to follow my Twitch stream to catch me live in action. I do stream daily on working days. I'm a full-time YouTube content creator and a Twitch streamer too, so if you want to support me, you can do it either from Twitch or by PayPal directly from my website angryroleplayer.com. Join my Discord channel too for a place to discuss RPG things offline, as well as follow my Twitter to be notified on any new content. If you want to get extra information like sneak peeks into upcoming videos, plans, different behind-the-scenes footage, you can also join the Unholy Army on Patreon as well, guys. Thank you very much once again for watching and listening to all this. See you soon.